Howdy folks, hope you've all had a great weekend and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. Before we crack on, discussing the various things that I wanted to talk about this week, I have a little offer you might be interested in. This week's episode of Mingles with Jingles, once again, I am very happy to be able to say, sponsored by Displate. I have been extremely happy with the Displate metal posters that I've received over the last couple of months. In fact, the toughest part of the whole process was just narrowing the selection down to 8 from the frankly breathtaking range of fandoms and brands that Displate have available for you to make the selection from. Pretty much everything that Displate has on offer is available in not only a huge range of sizes to fit your pocket, but also a huge range of finishes, including their new Textra finish, which, I mean, I could go on about how it matches the contour of the art in a unique way that draws the eye under all different kinds of lighting conditions, but honestly, it just looks cool. So, if you're finding yourself sufficiently motivated, I can help you out with a strain on your pocket by clicking the discount link in the description, which will take you to displate.com/MightyJingles, where the discount will be automatically applied at the checkout, or just use my code MightyJingles, which will get you 23% off one Displate, 27% off 2 or 3 Displates, or 33% off 4 or more. And if you're sitting on the fence about it, just go and take a look at the website and have a look at the stuff that they actually have available. I guarantee you will find something that you like the look of. So, well, once again, and as is becoming increasingly normal these days, if games from AAA publishers are all you're interested in, there is very, very little to talk about this week, as in most weeks. Although there is some news from the, I think, releasing about a month away from now, the upcoming Borderlands 4. And yeah, some of it is Randy Pitchford just being incapable of keeping his mouth shut. Although this time, in fact, you know what, we're not going to get into what Randy Pitchford's been saying because it's basically bollocks. It's just that you stick a microphone in front of the guy's face and he's just incapable of shutting his mouth. So he's been talking all kinds of bollocks about how Borderlands 4 encapsulates the dichotomy of the choice between anarchism or fascism, and just basically, he's just a noise-generating machine at this point. But hey, at least he's not going out of his way to actively upset people. I honestly think that the deal with Randy Pitchford is he is genuinely just one of those people who cannot admit that he just doesn't know the answer to a question. So you stick a microphone in front of him, you ask him a question he doesn't know the answer to, and he just spouts drivel until he runs out of breath. So there's that. But what the Borderlands 4 stuff that I did actually want to talk about, actually there's 2 things. First, and this isn't really anything new, because this has always really kind of been a feature of Borderlands. It's the kind of thing that they were yelling about during pre-release interviews. And in the original Borderlands, it's the sheer number of possible combinations of guns in the game. This time around, they're spouting figures like 30 billion different guns in the game. And it's one of those situations where they're not lying, but that doesn't mean they're telling the whole truth. You see, the thing about the guns in Borderlands, and the guns have always been one of the best things about Borderlands. You know, it's a shooter after all, so having good guns is important, and they have always had, well, I don't want to say good guns. They've certainly had a lot of them. I'll get onto this in a moment, because it's kind of part of the problem. But they've certainly had a lot of guns in the Borderlands series. Not all of them any good. In fact, statistically speaking, most of them probably a bit shit. But that's always been the way that Borderlands generated its guns, because it does generate them. They don't drop from a loot table or anything, which is the case in most other first-person shooters. It randomly generates the statistics of every gun that drops from a defeated enemy or gets looted from a chest, with very, very few exceptions, such as very, very specific boss drops. The statistics for any gun that you pick up in Borderlands have always been randomly generated. Every gun in the game has always had its statistics generated from various different characteristics like accuracy, magazine size, reload time, bullet spread, ammunition type, a whole bunch of different randomly generated statistics, which could mean that at any time the next gun that drops for you could be absolutely amazing with the best possible combination of statistics for its tier. But in practice, It's meant that of the millions of possible different gun combinations, most of them are kind of shit. So in previous Borderlands games, the sad truth of the matter was that the only thing that was functionally important to you, the player, about the millions and tens of millions and maybe even hundreds of millions of different possible combinations of gun that could drop was how many useless guns would stack up in your inventory that you'd have to get rid of before you actually got something that was good. So in practical terms, in Borderlands 2, for example, it just meant that every 10 minutes you'd have to empty your inventory and dump the 20 useless guns that you'd looted since the last time you actually picked up a decent gun, or at least a semi-decent gun, or at least one that wasn't completely shit. So in Borderlands 4, and remember, the hype train is starting to scale up because the game's about a month away from release, but in Borderlands 4 they're now bragging that the possible different number of gun combinations that it's possible for the game to generate is up to 30 billion. Now, I have a couple of questions. Actually, I have 4. Yeah, and so what? Because previously, with like a million different possible gun combinations all the way back in Borderlands 1, that just meant that I was emptying 20 pieces of shit out of my bags every 10 minutes in order to make space for the next 20 pieces of shit that were going to drop over the course of the next 10 minutes. And with 30 billion different guns available, does this mean that I'm going to be emptying my bags of complete and utter dog shit every 2 minutes? Because I don't see how that's a step forward. I mean, yeah, I'm not stupid. I get it. I know why they're suddenly spouting this 30 billion different combinations of types of gun available in Borderlands 4. More than in every other Borderlands game combined. I get it. It's big numbers. They're trying to generate hype. They don't really care whether or not they're talking utter bollocks, or whether or not anybody actually wants 30 billion different combinations of guns. That's always been the Borderlands thing, and this time around the numbers are bigger. So that's what they're talking about. Does it matter? No. Does it make any kind of functional difference in gameplay? Well, aside from generating an even wider range of useless shit that clogs up your bags that you just have to get rid of before you settle on something good? No, not really. Are they going to keep spouting this 30 billion number? You bet your ass they are. Because it's a bigger number. And that's how marketing works. It's not the only bigger number that they're hoping that we're going to get as excited as them about as well. And this next bit, I mean, the first part. Ray, 30 billion different guns. Yeah, big deal. Nobody cares. But this next part is actually... This could actually make something of a difference. And it's kind of depressing. Especially given who it's coming from. So, and don't worry, no, it's not Randy Pitchford. Randy Pitchford hasn't actually said anything meaningful since the last time he opened his mouth and put his foot right in it, which I suppose, is good. We should be grateful for small mercies. Now, this comes from Borderlands 4's lead character designer, Nick Thurston. Now, remember this, lead character designer. So, in a recent interview with Polygon, lead character designer Nick Thurston said, Borderlands 4 has more passive perks than all of the previous Borderlands combined, with each hero having around 80. Yeah, you heard that right. 80 different character skill perks per character. Now, he didn't go on to say specifically whether or not you'd be able to have all 80 of those perks. I suspect not, because of what he said next. The goal is maximum build diversity. It was always really important to me that if you have this really cool character, you're going to want to use him in a bunch of different ways. I really want to be like, we have 4 Amons in this group, and every single one of them has a different build. Yeah, no. So, a couple of things. Borderlands 4 basically has double, again, it's that obsession with just having bigger numbers rather than having them actually mean anything. Because Borderlands 4, it sounds like it has double the skill perks per character class of at least any previous Borderlands game. More does not necessarily mean better. Because in order for a skill choice to actually have any kind of impact, it has to mean something. And if you're doubling the number of skill points, you're diluting the impact of the available skills. You have to. Now, I admit, I haven't actually seen these expanded skill perk trees yet, but I know Gearbox, I know Randy Pitchford, and I will eat my own arse if this double the number of skill perks does not in practice mean that a perk that would have given you a 10% bonus on a certain skill activation and cost you 1 perk point in Borderlands 2 is going to end up doing exactly the same thing in Borderlands 4, but it'll cost you 2 perk points because it's the same skill split into 2 separate perks, each of which only give you 5%. But even if that's not the case, and you know that at some point in the skill perk trees it's going to be, but even if it isn't, and the lead character designer of Borderlands 4 has managed to achieve his goal of giving maximum build diversity, so you could have a theoretical party of 4 players, each of them playing exactly the same class, but each of them playing radically different game styles. Why? Why is diversity within classes important in a game that actually has character classes? If you can have a Siren with the same gameplay style as a Gunzerker, who has the same gameplay style as a Commando, who has, or can have, the same gameplay style as an Assassin, or a Necromancer, or a Psycho, then what is the point of having Sirens, Gunzerkers, Commandos, Assassins, Necromancers, or Psychos? If you want to cast spells, you don't pick the Psycho class. It's not just me, right? Surely the whole point of picking the classes is that's where the diversity is. Otherwise, why have classes in the first place? And this worries me, given that this is all coming from the lead character class designer. You see, I can kind of get this push for, I mean, he calls it diversity. I call it homogenization. But I can get the push for that sort of thing in a game that's based around competitive multiplayer. I mean, if you're playing something like, I don't know, Battlefield 6, Call of Duty, whatever, and there's one particular class and weapon combination that is clearly leagues better than anything else, everybody's going to be playing that, and that will be bad for the game. And so that needs to be balanced somehow, whether that means nerfing that or buffing everything else. And it's a tricky balancing act that game developers have to walk. And it's not easy to do, but it needs to be done. You've got to make, I don't know, maybe I'm showing my ignorance of first-person shooters off here, but you have to make the medic class as rewarding and profitable to play as the sniper or the machine gunner or whatever. Because if you don't, people just won't play medics. And hopefully, Nick Thurston, Borderlands 4's lead character class designer, is listening, because you don't balance that, you don't fix that by giving everybody defibrillators and medkits. You do that by fixing the medic. You make the medic fun and rewarding to play. You don't make the medic even more pointless by allowing every other class, through doubling their available skill perks, the ability to basically duplicate what the medic does. Yeah, it's not just me, is it? And the other thing that worries me about this whole, we're doubling the amount of perks that we have for maximum character diversity bollocks, is why are you fixing a problem that nobody's complaining about? Because of the kind of game that Borderlands is. This time around, as an example, I'll refer to something that I actually know about, because I don't know shit about Call of Duty or Battlefield or whatever. But if you were developing a game like World of Warcraft, or any MMO for that matter, where most of the endgame revolves around bunches of players banding together to defeat common objectives. But we'll stick with World of Warcraft for the moment. 1, because I know it, and 2, it perfectly illustrates the problem that World of Warcraft had, and which Borderlands 4 seems to think they have, but they 100% absolutely don't. So, World of Warcraft originally had a fairly big problem, and this problem reared its ugly head and became quite an issue for the game developers as soon as everybody reached the maximum level and started forming up into raid groups and heading into the raid dungeons and taking on raid bosses. The problem was that not every raid group was built the same way. The game developers had to design these boss fights, and they could take for granted a certain number of things. You could expect every raid group going into Molten Core, for example, to have this many tanks, this many healers, and this many DPS. And while it was kind of important, the specific classes of tanks that they had, it wasn't nearly as important as the number of tanks that they had, because certain boss fights required a certain number of tanks, and if you didn't have that number of tanks, then you couldn't do it. But, you know, the warrior was your go-to tank class. Paladins could also tank, druids could tank. The main thing is it didn't really matter whether you had 3 warriors, 3 paladins, 3 druids, or any combination of 3, as long as you had 3, right? It didn't really matter that much what they were. It was the same with healers. While everybody, at least in original World of Warcraft, preferred priests as the healers, it didn't matter whether or not you had 6 priests or a combination of priests, paladins, and druids, as long as you just had 6 healers. Just to, pick a random arbitrary number. And it was the same with the damage dealers. Whether you went in there with, 15 rogues and 15 mages, didn't matter. As long as you had 30 DPS and they were all capable of doing a basic minimum amount of damage per second, it really, really didn't matter what DPS classes you took. It was just the number of classes covering the role, that's what was important. Bearing that in mind, you could have huge diversity amongst all of those different roles. And it wouldn't matter as long as you had the numbers to cover the amount that were required to do that role. Now, I'm not going to go into laborious detail about the differences between all the classes. I'm just trying to make a general point here. But you could, for example, like a rogue, who was an ultra specialist in basically standing behind a raid boss and doing obscene amounts of single target damage. So great for raid bosses, not so good for clearing the trash leading up to the raid bosses. For that, you wanted something that could do like huge amounts of area effect damage, like a frost mage, for example, and so on and so on and so on. You get the idea. The point is that there was room for specialization, and it didn't really matter. You could have specialists, you could have generalists. It didn't matter because you'd have enough numbers overall to cover all the jobs that needed doing. And this was basically true, except for in one way. See, all of the players in World of Warcraft fell into one or two factions: Horde, Orcs, Trolls, Undead, and so on, or Alliance: humans, elves, dwarves, gnomes, and so on and so on. And only humans and dwarves could be paladins, which meant only an Alliance raid group could have paladins, and only Trolls and Orcs could be shaman, which meant only a Horde raid group would have shaman. And this caused the developers all kinds of problems because of the various different buffs, the very exclusive buffs that those character classes brought to one raid group that the other one wasn't going to have. So a shaman was the only character class that could do the bloodlust burst cooldown, which basically increased the entire raid group's haste by 40%. It was a huge burst damage buff that Alliance raid groups couldn't get. And paladins, which were Alliance only, humans and dwarves, could do blessings. And these were little mini buffs. Things like Blessing of Protection. If somebody over-aggroed and pulled threat off the tank, then a paladin could just Blessing of Protection on them and make them immune to damage, and they would immediately drop all threat. They also had Blessing of Salvation, which you would basically put on all of the DPS to reduce the amount of threat they generated, to ensure that the tanks had an easier time holding aggro on the bosses. All kinds of super useful utility blessings that only the Alliance had access to, which in practice meant that the game developers had given themselves a massive headache trying to balance every raid boss in the game so that it would work and provide the same amount of challenge for every raid group, whether they were Horde or Alliance. Because if you think about it, the Blessing of Protection in particular, or the Blessing of Salvation in general, there were, for example, you might have a boss fight where it was vitally important that nobody at any point ever pulled aggro off the tank, which was a bit of a challenge for a Horde raid group because they didn't have Blessing of Salvation, and if it did happen, they couldn't put Blessing of Protection on whoever had over-aggroed. Or you could have a boss fight that had a very, very narrow enrage timer, which could be a significant problem for an Alliance raid group because they didn't have the Bloodlust burst damage cooldown, but would make a boss fight trivial for a Horde raid group because they did. So, I mean, these were the big ones, but there were other things like that. Dwarf priests, for example. Every priest had their own specific racial ability. Undead priests could cast this offensive spell called Devouring Plague, which was cool, I suppose, but hands down, by far the best priest racial ability was dwarf priest's fear ward ability, because you'd have certain boss fights where every now and then the boss would do a bellowing roar or something that would fear the entire raid for 5 seconds, which doesn't sound terrible until you remember that some of these bosses are dragons and they've got this frontal fire breath and cleave attack, and they're still aggroing on the tank, and when the tank goes running around in fear because the boss has done this ability, and then the boss turns and breathes and cleaves and kills half the raid, well, good luck, try again. Unless you've got a couple of dwarf priests and they all just cast fear ward on the tank, completely trivialising an entire boss fight mechanic. And guess what? Only dwarf priests could cast fear ward. So, good luck if you were Horde, or if you were Alliance and all your priests were Night Elves. So, yeah, I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that they painted themselves into a corner by having these specialisations in World of Warcraft. And eventually, they just gave up, and they allowed the Horde to have paladins, and they allowed the Alliance to have shamans, and they gave the fear ward ability to all priests and things like that. They basically homogenized everything. They kind of had to do this in order to get themselves out of the corner that they'd painted themselves into. Because, well, they had a choice. Because if they were going to continue to allow the raids to be as specialised as they were, with only Alliance having the access to paladin blessings, and only the Horde having access to shaman totems and the bloodlust ability, and only, for example, dwarf priests having access to the fear ward ability, then that just made it increasingly difficult to design new boss fights every time a new tier of content came out with a new tier of raiding content. Because they had to continue to make sure that Alliance could do it without the bloodlust DPS buff, and that Horde could do it without all those useful paladin blessings. So spreading these abilities out and allowing Alliance to have Shaman and allowing Horde to have Paladins, and giving these specific abilities to more than just the one class was kind of necessary, because it allowed them to start making more complicated and more detailed and more interesting boss fights, whereas previously they would have been severely limited and hamstrung by ensuring that any raid group could defeat the bosses regardless of whether or not they were getting a 40% damage buff, or whether or not they were getting all these useful blessings. That they had to come up with a way of making it that it didn't matter, that everybody was going to have these abilities. They had to spread the abilities around, not just among factions, but among classes, to ensure that if the ability was needed because of a specific detail in a boss fight, the chances were very, very good, unless you had really bad raid composition, but the chances were very, very good that it was going to be there. And so you could design the boss fights, more interesting boss fights, around everybody having access to every ability in some shape or form, whether that was via a paladin blessing or a shaman totem or just a various different buff that a mage could cast. As long as more people could cover that one thing, you were good, and you could design more interesting boss fights. Because knowing that if a certain ability was required in order to defeat the boss in the encounter that you were developing, and if that certain ability was only available to one specialisation of one class, there's going to be an excellent chance that that specialisation might not be in the raid group. But if that ability was available on multiple different classes and characters, then you could confidently design the boss fight around it without having to worry about it. So, getting back to the Borderlands 4 thing, with lead character class designer Nick Thurston proudly proclaiming that Borderlands 4 will have exactly twice as many character perk options available as Borderlands 3. 80 different character perk options per character class. Dude, it's a single player game. Doesn't matter. It's not like you're ever going to be in a situation where your commando isn't going to be able to complete the game because it doesn't have the third tier siren character class perk. I mean, it's a single player game. At most, it's like 2 or 3 player co-op. Nobody gives a fuck. You just want to be able to say you've got twice as many perks as Borderlands 3, don't you? Yeah, it's like the 30 billion different guns. Even though, if you've got 30 billion different combinations, there's very little different about the overwhelming majority of them. If one gun is the same in every respect as another gun, except it shaves 1/10 of a second off the reload, is it really a different gun? I mean, technically it is, but is it really? It's not really, is it? And is having 80 character perks any better than having 40? Or is it even any different to having 40? Because if you end up in the same place, it's just cost you twice as many character perks to get there. Have you actually made a choice? You certainly don't appear to have made one that matters. And if the choices do matter, and I suspect they probably don't, but if they do matter, and you can create character builds that are so diverse that you're allowed to create, for example, a psycho who's as great with assault rifles as a soldier, then what's the point in having a soldier? What's the point in having any of the character classes if they don't matter and it's just a simple question of where you put your perk points? Now, I don't think it is. I think the different character classes are absolutely going to matter. I certainly hope the different character classes are going to matter, because if they're not, then what's the point in having them? But I think what we have here, and it's like earlier when Gearbox were proudly spouting the whole 30 billion different possible types of gun in Borderlands 4. Well, yeah, but if 99.8% of these guns are junk that's no better than whatever it was you looted 10 minutes ago, that you're just going to vend at the first available opportunity, then your 30 billion guns' only functional purpose is to double or triple the amount of shit that our packs are going to fill up with, necessitating a trip to a vendor in order to get rid of them. You're not actually improving the game in any way. Although you do have an impressive number that you can shout in interviews. And I suspect it's probably the same with this 80 character perks per character class. At best, it's just going to cost us twice the number of perks to achieve the same end result. At worst, it's just going to end up confusing players into putting their skill points into places where they really shouldn't, because you basically just made the character perk system twice as complicated as it needed to be. But hey, at least you've got an impressive number you can shout about in interviews ahead of the game's release. Around about a month from now. Remember, kids, don't pre-order. Wait for the reviews. Stop encouraging them. And on that bombshell, that's it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. I hope you've enjoyed it, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.